Whenever you see discussions about weapons and things like that, you always hear about how fast or nimble or agile a weapon is. And people debate this weapon is faster than that weapon, or whatever. But I don't recall ever seeing anybody try to actually do a dedicated speed test. So I figured I'd be the one to give it a try. I want to know, is there anything we can learn from doing this? Is there any point to doing a speed test? So we've got about 20 weapons, a diverse selection of weapons from all over the world. Some are very similar to each other, some are very different. And the purpose is to discover, is there any consistently noticeable or quantifiable differences in these weapons? Some of the items that we have here are just modern tools, some of them are modern reproductions, and we have quite a few antiques here, actual weapons that are hundreds of years old. So there's going to be 3 of us testing, myself, Brandon, Joe. We're all different sizes, we all have different martial arts backgrounds that we come from. We're each more proficient with certain weapons, and with some of them we don't know anything about. So we're going to be throwing a series of cuts and thrusts with one hand into. Each of these tests are meant to expose the strengths and weaknesses of every single item. This is all pretty experimental, so it's actually also a test of a test to see if this test is even a good test to have. And by having 3 of us, I think we can narrow down the consistencies. So I'm hoping you find this valuable. Let's just jump right into it.
No, it takes a lot to get used to.
It's definitely very, like, forward weight, yeah.
So this first one up is a Katana. It's made just like a regular Japanese katana, but it has a smaller blade. The reason for having a shorter blade is that you can unsheath it quicker, and it's much better in close quarters. Now this particular Katana was made specifically for cutting tatami. The blade is much broader than a normal katana, and has a narrow entry angle for its cutting edge. The instant you hold the sword, you can feel the forward weight of it. Here you can see all the times we recorded between me, Brandon, and Joe, and also the average time based on all our cuts.
I like the rip of that handle. That's nice.
This is a Nagamaki. It's meant to be sort of a hybrid between a katana and a naginata. The blade of a Nagamaki looks more like a naginata blade, and its handle is much longer than a standard katana handle. Now the handle on the version that we're using isn't quite as long as it should be. This Nagamaki is also a bit heavier than a standard katana. The Nagamaki is a battlefield weapon, and it was used in dense formations where longer pole weapons couldn't be used, with its main function being to take out cavalry. The long handle gives you good control and maneuverability, but it made it very difficult to use it one-handed, and for several of these tests it actually ended up catching on our clothes or hitting our arms. So you can't just use it like a regular katana. And there you can see the Nagamaki comes in overall slower than the Katana we first tested.
Now the interesting thing about this is like the instant I'm holding this, it now feels completely different from the katanas.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's just a different thing altogether.
That is theoretically meant to be a one-handed sword. Like,
it does feel good.
yeah.
I'll tell you that much.
So this is the Frontier Tang Dao by LK Chen. It's called by many the Chinese proto-katana, because it's believed that this is the sword that would eventually become the katana. It's a straight, single-edged sword with almost no hand protection, but it was extremely light and balanced. And it could be used just as easily in one hand as in two. Now while it's hard to tell, this sword does have a very small guard to stop blades from running down onto your hands, but it's really not much in terms of defense. This is actually the same sword that Matt Easton and Matthew Jensen did a review of, where they actually did some destructive testing on it. Out of the three, this one was by far the fastest. Interestingly enough, it did just as good in one hand as it did in two, although in the thrusting it was just as fast as the Kokatana.
The cool thing about cutting with those is, like, even if you cut with really bad edge alignment, it, like, self-corrects. Like just because of the way they're built, like if you're all a little off, it just steers right into the target when you hit it. Like they're just very easy to cut with.
So this is the Raptor Shobus Kukri by Hanwei. It's pretty much a standard katana except for in the way that it's made. It doesn't have the standard yokote transition that other katanas have, which gives it less ability to dissipate damage to the blade when performing a thrust. However, it was very balanced and just felt exactly like a katana should feel. Interestingly, this weapon was almost identical in performance as the Kokatana, and still slower than the Tang Dao. All the weapons so far have a very similar thrusting speed.
1700s, Omi Daisho Tadayoshi, fourth generation Tadayoshi line of smiths.
Okay.
Probably. Again, not papered, but it's very unusual to fake the fourth generation of Tadayoshi smiths because that was the generation where it went from being like legendary to just being like pretty good. So it'd be very easy to make that sword look like it was from the second one.
This sword was made by Hizen Kuni Omi Daijo Fujiwara Tadayoshi in the 1700s. This is an actual antique katana, and it's just about as big as the Nagamaki we tested earlier, while its weight was a little closer to the Raptor. The first thing I noticed when handling the sword is it's probably the most solid thing I've ever had in my hands. There was no rattle, no wobble. The blade presence was even greater than the Kokatana, which is similarly weighted but smaller. It actually felt way heavier than it actually was. And of all the swords we've tested so far, this definitely felt immediately in your hands like it could do the most damage out of any of them. So this one did even slower than the Nagamaki, which is interesting because they're both similar size, but this sword has a much longer blade.
And this way,
You have to keep it in motion or else it's useless.
even once you get it down, yeah, it is like,
Well, when you swing around and put it right back on your back, it actually feels quite nice. It feels very normal.
It just resting it on your back feels quite nice.
Well, no, I'm just saying when it swings, it just feels natural. It's,
Yeah.
it's
Oh,
kinda-
yeah, it doesn't want to stop.
coming from down, it's just from this dead position.
It's made to go down.
Yeah. You don't want to bring it up.
You're fighting.
You're
What's
fighting
the term? Going against the
You're
grain.
fighting the entire world, like dragging it down.
Yeah, that is just terrible.
Alright, so this next one is interesting. This is a Nepalese Kukri, nicknamed the Buffhead. And while a regular Kukri might just be 1 or 2 pounds, this thing weighs over 9. It's not actually a weapon though. It's nicknamed the Buff's Head because it's a ceremonial weapon meant for cutting the heads off a buffalo. And it's designed specifically for a downward cut. The short and thick handle makes it very hard to control. And that's because the point of balance is over a foot up the blade. And at that point of balance, the blade drops straight down, creating a massive amount of torque with very little handle to control it. So while it was only 2 pounds heavier than the Montante I tested in a previous video, it felt like it was 100 pounds heavier. I really wasn't expecting it to be as hard to handle as it was.
Oh, yeah, it's very
Nope. I don't even
It's watching you.
Yeah.
the swords.
You
are
get
the
very-
best one.
So while we weren't able to perform every test with this, it was obviously the slowest in every single category that we could get a test out of.
From here,
Mm-hmm.
or handling the pommel, which feels better with this.
Yeah, the pommel is like, it's meaty on that one. Like,
Yeah.
that's got some real, like,
So it
heft
really
to it. Yeah.
bugs my hands.
This next one up is a crucifix form sword called the Cressy War Sword made by Kingdom of Arms. While swords like this are typically longer than katanas, this one is almost the same size and weight as the Shobus Kukri that we tested a bit earlier. This sword has a wheel pommel, which is my personal preference for swords. I believe it gives you different options for throwing cuts, and they look really good when you're going for a pommel strike. I also think they make it a bit easier to retain edge alignment. because the pommel aligns with the edge of the blade. The straightened crossguard on swords like these could be sharpened, which could be especially useful when fighting people in armor. So in terms of speed, it was on average similar to the Katana and the Raptor Sakuri, or the Shobus Sakuri, but just a little bit slower overall.
Yes, it feels nice. Like that's yeah. I'm not a big fan of the black blade, but this handle's nice. I do like it.
I like it. I mean,
This next one is the Battlecry Bosworth sword by Windless Steelcrafts, and it's the longest weapon we've tested so far, just a little bit longer than the antique katana that we just tested. Despite their similarities, this was actually a much more nimble weapon, because the point of balance is much farther down the blade in comparison. The sword has a curved crossguard that flares away from the hands and interferes less with mobility, while giving it slightly better ability to control an opponent's weapon. Interestingly enough, this weapon was faster or similar to the Tang Dao in several categories, only being much slower in the one-handed cut.
I have seen where they just
Literally,
snap in
it's
place
like
and make it
exactly
kneel.
as wide as my hand.
I love it.
This is an Alexandrian sword, one of the heaviest weapons that we test today. And I don't think it's very hard to notice how broad the blade is, which is roughly the width of your hand. They're called Alexandrian swords because they're stored in an arsenal in Alexandria, Egypt. Many of them were claimed as prizes during battles between Muslim and Christian armies, and they were sent to the Sultan as tribute. And while it is pretty heavy for a longsword, it actually didn't feel very heavy at all. This one has a wide base blade that tapers to a thin point, making it good for chopping and thrusting. Despite it being one of the heaviest weapons we tested so far, it kept up with the other swords. This is the Laird, as a Scottish sword by Albion. And while this one weighs the same as some of the previous swords, it performs much better in the one hand because of the length of the handle. The wheel pommel on this sword catches against your hand and prevents you from casting it out too far, which allows you to recover the blade quickly and return with another strike. I really like the sword. It was a really good balance between power and mobility. The sword rests nicely in the hands, and it works very well with the shield. By being similar overall in length and weight to the Tang Dao, it actually did much better in the one-handed category, and a bit slower with two hands. But overall, one of our fastest weapons.
Well, there's a little opportunity to catch the blade too if you time it right.
Yeah, you can scoop it, and also it doesn't poke you in the wrist. It just deflects past it, which is nice. That's
Yeah.
Well, it's not just about scooping. If somebody actually comes over, like if somebody comes over
yeah.
like this and you turn, you can trap it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
This is the Earl by Albion. It's about a pound heavier than the first two long swords we tested, but a little lighter than the Alexandrian sword. It has a really cool S-shaped crossguard. It has the potential to catch an opponent's blade if you know how to do it. This style of sword was popular in Germany, and while swords like this didn't always have this kind of crossguard, they always had extremely long handles. The Earl was very similar in length and weight to the antique katana that we've tested, but is overall much faster than the Nagamaki or the antique. This is an Indian Bulova axe. Sadly, we didn't get very many tests out of it. It started to have some problems as I was swinging it. This is an actual antique. This is not some reproduction. I believe it's about 200 years old. It was the most unique axe I've ever held because it was extremely lightweight. The shaft that it was mounted on is extremely thin and completely round, which made it really difficult for me to find the edge alignment. I don't know much about this weapon, but it was very much unlike any other axe I've ever handled in my life. This is just a modern tree felling axe. I really just wanted to include this so you can see the disparity between this kind of tool and an actual weapon that's supposed to be fast and functional. While double-sided axes were rare in military history, they have a specific purpose for cutting down trees. One of the edges is coarse for heavy chopping, and there's a finer edge on the other side for carving and stuff like that. And having two edges allows you to quickly perform a rising cut after you've gone into a low position from a downward cut. Obviously one of the slowest weapons we've tested so far, by far. Faster than the Kukri, but slower than everything else. Although it should be noted that its thrusting speed, while it doesn't have a thrusting point, its thrusting speed was comparable to any other weapon we've tested so far.
Yeah, let's go with that one.
This is a Skeg Ox, or a bearded hand axe by Cold Steel. Bearded axes are very useful because they can be used to hook shields or even incoming weapons. And the blade is actually quite thin. If you try to chop a piece of wood with this, it would just stick straight in. It wouldn't wedge it apart like a tree felling axe or a wood chopping axe. This is a common feature of combat axes. However, this weapon doesn't perform nearly as well as it can because the handle's way too long. And that's why I wanted to include it specifically. The length of the handle in this situation completely ruins the balance of the weapon. And there you go, the results pretty much show that while this is meant to be a one-handed weapon, its results are similar to the two-handed weapons we've tested so far. The Norse Hawk by Cold Steel has an appropriately sized handle. And as you can see, the difference in performance is undeniable. It's fast, agile, balanced, and it hits really hard. It can be used in one hand or it can be thrown. It should be noted that this is basically a tomahawk with a Norse-inspired blade. This isn't actually based off of a historical weapon. I did bring a standard tomahawk that we planned on testing, but we ran out of time. And yeah, the Norse Hawk, while very similar to the Skeg Ox in weight, performed overall better than pretty much every other weapon we've tested so far.
I should have showed all the weapons to the camera. I'm such an idiot. I'm such a bad YouTube.
This is the Cinque Dia, or the Cinque Dita. It was a civilian sidearm used in Italy during the Renaissance around the 15th, 16th centuries. I don't know if you would call this a sword or a really long dagger, but it kind of functions as both. While daggers of the Renaissance focused on thrusting, the Cinque Dia was an effective cutter also, making it very useful for self-defense in tight places. So yeah, I mean, the Cinque Dia was the smallest, lightest weapon, and it is, in every single category, the fastest weapon we've tested today.
Yeah, that's I feel like horseback swords tend to be a little bit too long and heavy.
Just cut people down.
Yeah. Well, like all of your strokes are aided by gravity when you're on horseback, and you need that extra reach. So like they tend to be a little longer and heavier than foot soldier swords.
This is a Roman Spatha by Albion Arms called the Auxilia. This was first used as a cavalry weapon, which is why it's so long for a one-handed weapon. While cavalry would use the Spatha, infantrymen would use the gladius, but eventually Roman infantry would start using the Spatha as their main weapon. The Spatha was actually first introduced to the Romans by the Celts. The rounded features on the handle allow for maximum mobility. You can swing it completely unhindered, while the rounded pommel performs the same function as the pommels on similar one-handed weapons from later centuries, like the Laird we tested earlier, or so-called Viking swords. This is pretty interesting. The Spatha, which is just a little bit smaller than the Tang Dao, it did similar or better than the Tang Dao in every single category.
rolled up piece of cardboard that I can't get through with a good sharp katana and a hard cut. Didn't even feel it.
Really?
Did this right. It was just like popped off. Never even felt it. It never even felt it touch the target. That's So it's effective at what it does, but it only does one thing.
This is a one-handed weapon from India called the Talwar, and it's extremely good at cutting for a one-handed weapon. Now this one is another antique, I believe from the 1800s. The crossguard is a bit small, much like a messer. The handle is all metal and it's pretty ergonomic. The problem with this thing though is its iron disc pommel, and it actually cut into your wrist or your palm if you cast it out too far. And none of us are experts using this, so we probably weren't using the way it was intended to be used. Here's where we started to cut down on the test a little bit. They just started to seem a little redundant for some of these one-handed weapons we're about to dive into, but obviously in the one-handed category this weapon did very well.
Right away, I'm looking at this thing and
Yeah.
I immediately want to stab.
Nope.
And,
Nope. Just the weirdest edge is sharpened.
This is a sword from Nepal called a Kora, and it's one of the most unique weapons I've ever seen. Much like the big Kukri we tested earlier, this weapon has a very high point of balance, and then the blade dips down. Although this weapon is nowhere near as bad as that. It's also only sharp on the inside of the blade. It was easier to control because it has that disc pommel much like the Talwar. We also encountered some of the same problems with it scraping our hands. The tip of the sword is the most unique aspect of it, I think. It flares out in this unique shape, but it doesn't seem to be specifically useful for anything, though I'm sure you wouldn't want to get hit by it. This was a primary weapon of the Gurkhas during the 10th century AD, and since being replaced by the Kukri, it's largely a ceremonial weapon, used in the execution of animals during festivals. Despite being a one-handed weapon, its size and weight made it one of the slower weapons in the categories we tested it in. This is just a machete, just another modern tool that I wanted to use for a baseline. It's extremely lightweight with a very ergonomic handle, really just meant for cutting and clearing out foliage. In Haiti, there are martial arts based around the machete, and there are some principles in Haitian machete that can be very useful if you're trying to use a messer, for example. So yeah, while the machete doesn't have a lot of options, it's extremely fast. This next one is an Italian military weapon from the 19th century, also an antique. The really cool part about this blade is the finger ring, which sits inside the knuckle bow. This drastically improves how you can manipulate the weapon. When I first attempted these tests, I only had one finger through the finger ring, and it was very difficult to control and I felt it scraping against my skin. When I was advised to put 2 fingers through the finger ring, suddenly I was able to manipulate the weapon much better. So yeah, the numbers on the Albertina are very respectable. One of the very fastest weapons that we've tested all day in every category. This is another antique. This is the model 1840 NCO sword, a United States military sword. It's extremely similar in size and weight to the Albertina we just tested. It's just slightly shorter with a slightly higher point of balance. And while it could perform cuts, its thick spine made it better suited for thrusting. This sword was the sword of American soldiers for over 70 years. So these swords would have seen service in the Mexican War, the Civil War, and the Spanish-American War. And to no surprise, the Albertina and the Model 1840 did extremely similar, being on the surface at least, very identical weapons. Alright, so what did we learn here? It's impossible to say this is conclusive. All 3 of us performed the test in different ways. I'm sure we'll find there's things we could have done better or better tests we could have chosen. But let's just look at what we got here. Here are the results for the one- and two-handed cuts. And in the one-handed category, you can obviously see that it's dominated by the swords that were meant to be used in one hand, with the shorter, lightweight weapons doing way better. The exceptions being the Kora and the Skeg Ox, which are right next to each other. The Skeg Ox is meant to be a one-handed weapon, but it suffers because the handle's too long, even though it's a very lightweight weapon. And the Kora is obviously very forward-weighted. The majority of weapons did much better in 2 hands than one, except for the weapons where it was pointless to use it with 2 hands, such as the Laird and the Cinque Dia. You may also notice that the various long swords and katanas are very close to each other. While a lot of these times don't seem like massive differences, Milliseconds do matter in the heat of a fight. For example, I tried using a longsword in one hand in a sword and buckler fight, and I was hugely outmatched by my opponent, even though these weapons don't necessarily weigh much different. The fact that this longsword just wasn't made for one-handed combat, meaning that the handle was too long and it didn't fit in my hand properly, and stopped from overcasting. With thrusting, we see almost the exact same thing, but we see a far less of a disparity between the times. The one-handed weapons dominate pretty much at the top, but the two-handed weapons aren't very far behind at all. In fact, even the biggest, slowest weapons, like the tree axe, were only about a second slower than the fastest weapon. Now, the left-handed thrust was done all by right-handed people. So this thrust comes from a little farther back, and it's basically for the weapons that were too big to do with a regular right-handed thrust or one-handed thrust with the right hand. For the boar's tooth combo, we see a bit more of a reordering of the ranking here. All of the longswords did pretty good here because they have that other edge, it makes it a lot easier to perform this test. But the katanas probably suffered a little unfairly on this one because me and Brandon didn't quite know the technique that Joe used, where he turned the blade in his hand, while as me and Brandon turned our entire hand to realign the blade. It's still interesting that the longswords were able to keep up or surpass some of the lightweight one-handed weapons. Now for the Zwerchkopter, it's kind of interesting. Katanas were much more difficult to do this technique because we had to keep on realigning the blade as we were swinging it against the double-edged weapons, which were much more easy to perform the technique. But the Japanese swords, or most of them, did just as well in comparison. So these results are essentially how well the weapon did when combining the times of all of the two-handed tests for the weapons that could do all the two-handed tests. We also did another series of tests where we used a pocket knife, which is basically weightless, to create a baseline for what would be the fastest possible time we could achieve. The percentage that you see there is effectively how much longer it took for the weapon to perform the same tests as it took to perform those tests with essentially nothing in your hand. The pocket knife we used just for edge alignment. So as you can see, the Bosworth Battlecry sword performed all these tests much faster than any other sword, and it only took 19% longer for it to perform the tests. Every sword from the Earl to the Cressy performed pretty similar, with the tree felling axe and the buff-set Kukri obviously being at the bottom, far below the others. This list is shorter than the others because obviously there weren't that many weapons that we could test with two hands. They were just too small. The next one is the results of just the one-handed thrust and the one-handed cut, which most of the weapons were able to do to some capacity. And as you can see, the Cinque Dia and the Machete far above the competition here, being the lightest and smallest weapons. And also, no surprise here, the weapons that were meant for one hand obviously dominate this category. So overall, I think it was useful. There's some really interesting consistency. These tests were meant to expose the strengths and weaknesses of every single weapon. And I think it did a pretty good job at that. I'm sure there's other things we could have done when we come back and look at this, but I think it's valuable for what it is, as long as you take it for what it is. It can definitely give you a sense of perspective. A lot of people like to make claims about how fast and agile certain weapons are, or there's a lot of misconceptions out there. And now you can kind of see it, you know? But this is something we can definitely do again. We do have access to a lot more weapons. You've probably seen some of them in my earlier videos. But we really couldn't get out to all of it in one day. But yeah, we can definitely do this again if people want. I definitely want to hear if people want to see this again, or if you have suggestions, we'll definitely add it to the next time we do this. If you'd like to see more of these weapons, Joe actually has a TikTok where he's done several cutting videos involving a lot of these weapons. It took about 4 weeks to edit this video. I do have a full-time job and kids, you know. So if you want to let us know this was worth the effort, I'd really appreciate it. My analytics say that only about 4% of my viewers are even subscribers. So if you do like this, please subscribe. It helps out a lot. I'm trying to grow this channel. I have a lot of plans. And there's a lot of cool stuff we can do. But I hope you found this video useful. And make sure to hit like and subscribe. And I'll see you next time.